Hey everybody, welcome to Music Theory 2, lecture number 1. I'll be your host, Dr. Professor David Bashwinner. And it's nice to meet all of you. Some of you I really don't know, I don't think, but some of you I do know that I do know. So I'm looking forward to meeting you and working with you more. This video probably will not be too long. This is not my most exciting video. I'm just warning you. I haven't even done it yet. I just know it's not going to be exciting. There's almost no music in it. It's just words. But maybe at some point I'll sing, "Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling, from glen to glen and down the mountainside." Okay, Music Theory 2, review of Music Theory 1. You might know my talk, famous video talk, Music Theory 1, review of Theory 0. Not true. Okay. Welcome. So these are just the elements that are in each chapter of the Lates book. Chapter 1, you learned about pitches, you learned about intervals, you learned about meters and rhythms. Presumably you sort of knew that stuff already, but you know it even more now. Chapter number 2, the discussion was a little bit about melody, but mostly about counterpoint. So counterpoint, we're going to talk about that in the next lecture, but you could think of counterpoint as two melodies happening at the same time. Number 3, chapter 3, triads, seventh chords, textures. Everybody kind of always needs work on triads and seventh chords. So the musician program that you're doing stuff in definitely helps you drill that. You're doing 2 assignments in that per week, and you can always do additional practice in there by just going to the practice screen and choosing whatever level feels best for you. Chapter 4, hierarchy, embellishing tones, non-chord tones, in other words. We will do more with embellishing tones or non-chord tones. Actually, we do some in the very next lecture, and then there's a chapter on it, either chapter 10 or 11 this summer. Hierarchy is a cool concept, and we talk about that a little bit also in that second lecture. What was I going to say about it, though? I won't go into it all that much right now. It's probably one of the most interesting aspects of music theory once you get past the basics of understanding sort of like how chords are formed. Everything above that is pretty much hierarchical arrangement of sounds and how that makes complex utterances. You know, sounds are sort of presented one at a time. Like if you're an instrumentalist like a clarinetist, you play one note at a time in order. But listeners don't hear it that way. I mean, they hear one note at a time, but they sort of put the notes together into structures, and they do that based on hierarchical principles. So it does become pretty fascinating, and almost everything in the book is in some sense related to this hierarchical idea. Okay. Oh, so embellishing tones. Embellishing tones means the same thing as non-chord tones, except that embellishing tones also includes this thing that Lates calls the chordal leap. He also calls it the chordal skip at some point, but that's only in the chapter he introduces it. Now he just calls it chordal leap. And so all the other things are non-chord tones, but the chordal leap is actually a chord tone. That's why he uses the larger phrase embellishing tones. So chordal leaps, passing tones, those are non-chord tones. Neighbor tones, those are non-chord tones. And then you'll eventually learn some more categories like suspension, anticipation, appoggiatura, what else? Pedal. I think there's some more in there. Accent and passing tone, accent and neighbor tone. Okay, chapter 5. You started talking about tonic and dominant functions, again in the second lecture. I'll talk more about function versus chord, so you'll get a review of that. But even on the next screen, I do have some of this review stuff. So in that chapter on tonic and dominant functions, in order to consider what is a function versus just a chord, considering what is more versus less stable, you are considering where the cadences are. You are considering such things as voice leading. I don't know if that's 100% true, but you at least learned how to voice lead in that chapter. And then in chapter 6, there's more stuff on hierarchy, and that's related to this principle of reduction and elaboration. So let's say let's take our clarinetist, and let's say our clarinetist is arpeggiating a whole bunch of notes, all different octaves, but they're the notes B flat, D, and F. Right? So maybe B flat, D, F, B flat, D, F, B flat. Right, so the clarinetist is presenting one note at a time. It's a kind of melody, but it's easy to see that as a structure, as just a chord that they are arpeggiating. So you could take that linear string of notes and reduce it to a single time point and say that's just a linear melodic version of a single moment in time, which would be a B flat major chord. So that's the idea of hierarchy there that relates to reduction and elaboration. So the reciprocal is you're the composer. You want to create, you want a B flat major chord, but you want it to be melodic as opposed to just a thing that happens all at once. So the clarinetist can play it. So you take the notes B flat, D, and F, and then you string them out linearly. So you elaborate the B flat major chord to compose, and then when you're analyzing, you look at something that's elaborated and you reduce it. That's what you learned in chapter 6. And you learned some stuff about the dominant 7th chord, so how things are different when you have a 7th on the 5 chord and not just a 5 triad. Okay. So in chapter 5, these are some concepts that you discussed. So I'm assuming this video you can go back and watch it sort of as many times as you want. You should be probably taking notes right now, even if it's just to tell yourself where in this video you want to come back and look at stuff. A lot of it is just kind of businessy stuff that, for instance, abbreviations I use on homework grading that might be helpful later. Okay, so with respect to stability and instability, generally we think of the tonic chord as being stable, dominant chord as unstable. And as we go on with the semester, you learn, a lot more subtle stuff than just that. If that was all there was to it, it would not be very interesting. Okay, cadences. By definition, I mentioned this in the Zoom video that I made this morning. Cadence by definition is going to be something that ends a phrase. The cadences that we have that do that are either the perfect authentic cadence or the imperfect authentic cadence or the half cadence. So the perfect authentic and imperfect authentic end on the tonic, and the half cadence ends on the dominant. So cadences that end phrases are the perfect authentic. There's 3 things to remember about perfect authentic cadences. This is one of these things that you should definitely write down. Perfect authentic cadences, they go 5 to 1. All authentic cadences do that. But additionally, perfect authentic cadences both chords are in root position, and the melody moves to scale degree 1 by step. So T-do or Re-do if you're in major, C-la or T-la if you are in minor. So an imperfect authentic cadence is just going to be, it's still going to be 5-1 motion like here, like with authentic cadence, but either one of the chords won't be in root position, or more frequently, the melody resolves on scale degree 3 instead of scale degree 1, scale degree 3 or scale degree 5. When you have one of the 2 chords are both in root position, but it still definitely feels like a cadence, then you call that a contrapuntal cadence. Lates includes contrapuntal within the category of imperfect. And, if any of this is confusing, just go back into chapter 5 and check this out. So half cadence, Phrygian half cadence. People often forget that term, so you might want to make a note to yourself to remember what Phrygian half cadence is. It's always in a minor key. It's always when you're going a minor 4/6 chord to a 5 chord. That makes it a Phrygian half cadence. So you don't ever have to mark a Phrygian half cadence as being anything special. It's just a half cadence. It's a phrase that ends on 5. But that thing is common enough that it's good to know that term. So it's always a 4/6 chord going to a 5 chord in a minor key. And let's say we're in A minor for a minute. Just think about what the bass note of a 4/6 chord is. We're in A minor, so let's actually think about the bass note of a 5 chord. That's going to be an E. The bass note of a 4/6 chord, the 4 chord in A minor, be D, F, A. And if it's in first inversion, F is in the bass. So you're going to get F going to E in the bass. So that's scale degree 6 going down to scale degree 5. That's always going to be what's happening in a Phrygian half cadence. Okay, and then we have other things that we call cadences, but these aren't real cadences because we don't consider them to end a phrase. So at least the way we're defining the stuff in this class, a deceptive cadence is not a cadence. So perfect authentic cadence goes 5 to 1. A deceptive cadence goes 5 to 6. You'll learn about that. We'll study this in chapter 13 of this semester. But a 5 going to a 6 chord really makes it feel like, we thought we were going to cadence, but we didn't. So the deceptive cadence is not actually a cadence. When we're doing phrase diagrams later, you're going to be diagramming, phrases. If something isn't a cadence, then it doesn't end a phrase. And so if it doesn't end a phrase, you don't need to consider it in your phrase diagram because you're just diagramming phrases, basically. So this is why this stuff is important. You have an evaded cadence, and, generally, like this term is vague, but the way Lates defines it is it's like you're on 5, like you're going to go to a 1 chord, but instead you bring in the 7th in the bass of the 5 chord to make it 5-4-2, and then you go to a 1-6. A 5-4-2 always goes to 1-6, any context. And we'll talk about that more, but the reason why is that the 7th is in the bass of this 5 chord that goes to a 1 chord, and the 7th is always going to resolve down by step. So remember, this 5-4-2 always goes to 1-6. And remember, evaded cadence as basically a 5-4-2 going to 1-6, or 5-5-4-2, 1-6. Like I said, we'll talk about this more as we go on. Plagal cadence goes from 4 to 1. So you often find this at the end of a piece, but the reason why this is not a real cadence, it's called the amen cadence, and the reason it's not a real cadence is that usually the piece ends with a proper 5-1 cadence, perfect authentic cadence, and then at the end it tacks on an amen, and then that's a plagal cadence, and it certainly functions to like end the piece even more. But if you just throw in a 4 chord going to a 1 chord in the middle of a piece, it's not going to feel like a cadence in the same way that a 5 chord to a 1 chord typically does. So that's why plagal does not function as a cadence. Just want to remind you guys that I said this is not going to be the most exciting video in the world. Just talking, no music. These are all basic things that you should know from Theory 1 and fundamentals. What I'm also doing is I'm not just reviewing, but I'm like helping you think of these things in my language and the way we talk about it. So I would guess that other teachers aren't really as explicit as I am about the definition of phrase, right? If you looked up phrase in the dictionary, you wouldn't find my David Bashwinter's definition. I try to do a definition that is as consistent with Lates as possible. But in order to do that, I make it a little bit more extreme than Lates makes it, just so it can be very clear. So anyway, in this video, you're learning how I talk about stuff. So that will help down the road. But if some of this feels new, that's great. You are learning some new stuff in this discussion. And all this stuff is at your fingertips in chapters 1 through 6. And if this video encourages you, makes you more likely to go back and review that stuff, then that is fantastic. How you guys doing? You want to try and guess what I'm eating? Nope. That's close. That was close. Someone guessed lasagna. Pizza. Voice leading. Again, in the next couple weeks, I'll do some review of these principles, but here they are in a written, wordy form. These are some preliminaries, and on the next page, I'll give you the rules that Lates gives you in the textbook. So, reminder that there are 4 types of contrapuntal motion. This is like the motion between 2 voices. Contrary, oblique, parallel, similar. Oh, you can remember it as COPS. Contrary, oblique, parallel, similar. I don't know if you need to, but you can. So contrary is like, here's like, let's say orange is the soprano and the blue is the bass. Or let's say orange is alto, blue is tenor. They're moving toward each other, contrary motion. If the alto is staying at the same pitch, but the tenor is moving relative to it, so smaller interval, larger interval, that's called oblique. One of them is staying the same. Parallel and similar are themselves similar to one another, but parallel means the interval here between alto and tenor is going to be the same as the interval here. It's a third. It might be a major third and a minor third, or minor third and major third. That doesn't matter, but they're parallel because it's the same generic interval, thirds. Similar motion, they might still be moving upward, but the alto is moving up, more up than the tenor. So, and then the interval here is a third and then a fourth. So they're still both moving up, but that would just be called similar motion because it's not parallel. It's not the same interval. So styles of 4-part writing. When you're doing figured bass, you're always going to write in 4 voices. You're always going to include Roman numerals with figures. And unless Lates tells you otherwise, you're always going to write in chorale style, which is soprano and alto on the top staff and tenor and bass on the bottom staff. The other option that he sometimes has you do is called keyboard style, where you have soprano, alto, and tenor, so the top 3 voices on the top staff and the bass on its own staff. For tendency tones, you know the stuff, that in general, anything that's a dissonance tends to need to be treated in a specific way, whereas consonances are pretty free. It's not the case really in rock music, but basically in all other types of music, that's the case. Sometimes, I don't know, rock musicians just like to have weird sounds that don't necessarily resolve in a specific way. And I'm talking about, not all rock. Anyway, forget it. Okay. Okay, so and then the 5/7 chord, for instance, you're going to have two tendency tones. So imagine a 5/7 chord resolving to a 1 chord. You have the 7th of the 5/7 chord. Let's put ourselves in C major. This chord is going to be G, B, D, F. The 7th F of the chord has to resolve down. The F is going to resolve down to the E of a C chord, C, E, G. So 7ths resolve down. Now, what you have to do is be sure not to confuse the 7th of the chord with scale degree 7. I try never to say 7th of the scale. So if I say 7th TH, I mean the 7th of the chord, right? 7th above the root note of the chord. Whereas if I'm talking about scale degree 7, I don't say 7th. I say scale degree 7 or leading tone. And this is not super important, but you did learn about this in chapter 5, chapter 6, that the 7th, like with suspensions, which we do in a couple chapters, the 7th is often prepared as a suspension from the previous chord. Let's not worry about that too much for right now. Okay, so like I said, the 7th of the chord resolves down. You do have to be careful not to confuse that with the leading tone, which is scale degree 7, right, which wants to resolve up. This is one of these things, like throughout history, scale degree 7 did have to resolve up, but later composers, like by which I mean classical and romantic composers, if the leading tone's in an inner voice, they often did not resolve the leading tone up. But if it's in an outer voice where it's very audible, then it does have to resolve up. So the rule now, ever since, let's say, 1750 or so, is your leading tone has to resolve up if it's in the soprano or the bass. Otherwise, if it's in the middle, it doesn't matter. But this rule about the 7th of the chord, that's always going to be the case in whatever voice it's in. Then one last thing, augmented intervals generally tend to resolve outward, and diminished intervals tend to resolve inward. So if you have a diminished fifth, let's say from B, if we say we're in C major, and we have a B up to an F, that's a diminished fifth. The B is going to resolve to C, the F resolves down to E. If you take those same notes and you put F below B, that makes it an augmented fourth, F, G, A, B. The F is still going to resolve down to E, the B resolves up to C, but they're inverted now, right? So the augmented fourth resolves outward to a minor sixth, sorry. Voice leading rules. I put this all on one page here, so in case you want to do like a screenshot and save this, you have it. I also pointed out that it's pages 182 to 183. But let me break this down on the next screens. I'm going to do one screen each for 1, 2, 3, and 4. Big points. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so one general principle that Lates gives you is you want to move the voices as little as possible when you're changing chords. This is important. You kind of know at this point that, let's say you're playing a 1-5-1 and you're playing it on the piano, say. You shouldn't do what are called block chords, like just play a C, E, G in right hand and then move your whole hand up by 5 steps and go G, B, D and then back to C, E, G, right? You're allowed to do that. But that's not considered good voice leading. It gives you parallel fifths. Ideally, what you'd want to do if you have C, E, G, and you want it to go to G, B, D, you take the C down to the B, you take the E down to the D, and you keep the G voice on the same note. Right? So you're moving the voices as little as possible. That is this basic principle. So in the spirit of that general rule, you have the general guideline. You have the first rule. Lates gives you rules versus guidelines here. Rule number 1 is resolve tendency tones. So like we just said on the previous screen, the 7th of the chord has to resolve down. The leading tone, scale degree 7, wants to resolve up. If it's in an outer voice, it has to resolve up. If it's in an inner voice, it doesn't have to. Guideline number 1, so this you're allowed to mess with this. It's just a guideline for kind of how to do your homework and stuff like that. Retain common tones where possible, moving the upper voices mostly by step. The bass tends to leap around a bit, and if you have a melody, like a melody proper, there's going to be a lot more leaps, but you don't usually put leaps in the alto and tenor unless you really need to. So definitely don't jump around needlessly. When you do, I write LL on your paper, which means leaping lizards, as you'll see on a later screen. Guideline number 2. Avoid melodic leaps involving dissonant intervals, including in inner voices. So that's actually definitely the case in inner voices. If you are gonna leap around in the inner voices, you got to make it so it's easy to sing, because tenors and altos have trouble finding their parts, not because they're not good musicians, just because that is a hard thing to do if you're in an inner part. What I put here is it is okay to leap a diminished fifth. So let's say we're in C major, and we could, I'll give us a C, C, D, E, F, G, F, E, D, C, B. You could leap from B up to F. That's fine, but you really don't want to leap from F up to B and then C. E. That's a general rule to keep in mind. Not a huge deal, but good to note. If you are going to leap a diminished fifth, from B up to F, B, C, D, E, F, or let's even say a minor seventh, C, D, C, D, C, right? Or a minor sixth or something like that. You want to counter that leap in the opposite direction by moving stepwise. So B, F, E, or D, C, B, step in the opposite direction. I could go E, C, that's a minor sixth, E, C, B. So a big leap, you counter it in the opposite direction. Okay, so this is a guideline to try to avoid melodic leaps. I'm saying it is actually okay to leap a diminished fifth. But if you are going to do a big leap, especially if it's a voice, you do want to counter it in the opposite direction. And then I'm pointing out here that that applies specifically to melodies. Soprano lines, sometimes bass lines if the bass is more melodic. But notice that if you're talking about arpeggios, right, like on a piano or a guitar or something like that, you don't pay attention to these rules at all. It's perfectly fine to leap a minor sixth in the middle of an arpeggio, right? That's a completely different thing. Okay, general thing number 2, maintain the independence and musical territory for each voice. So this is rule number 2. Avoid parallel perfect intervals. You know about that. Rule number 3, avoid doubling your tendency tones. Which are the tendency tones? The 7th and the leading tone, scale degree 7. Why would you have this rule, avoid doubling tendency tones? The reason is because, let's say, the 7th always has to resolve down by step. If you put 2 different voices on the 7th, they're both going to have to resolve down by step, right? So then you're going to get parallel octaves. Oh, and by the way, this avoid parallel perfect intervals, that does not apply to fourths. It's perfectly fine to have parallel fourths. It doesn't come up that much, but anyway, you can do parallel fourths. Okay. Rule number 4, no more than an octave between adjacent upper voices. Oh yeah, I wrote a little tune for this. Let me just pause here and grab my guitar. Okay, you ready for it? No more than an octave. Whoa, again. No more than an octave between adjacent upper voices. And you can just loop that over and over again. You should definitely remember that one verbatim. Why do you remember it verbatim? Because it's action-packed. It's got a lot in it. If I said, are you allowed to have exactly an octave between adjacent upper voices? The answer is yes. You can have no more than an octave, but you could have exactly an octave. If I said, could you have less than an octave? The answer is yes. If I said, can you have more than an octave between tenor and soprano? The answer is yes. You can have more than an octave between tenor and soprano because they're not adjacent. What about if I said, can you have more than an octave between the bass and tenor? The answer is yes, you can have more than an octave between bass and tenor because the tenor is an upper voice, but the bass is a lower voice. Okay, so that's why you remember that one verbatim. Guideline number 3, avoid voice crossing and voice overlap. These things always get confused. It took me many years of teaching before I even knew the difference between the two of them. Ooh, it's raining. So here's a little picture. Voice crossing. You can see the red. That will make that the alto. Alto is singing these pretty notes, and then she goes down here, and simultaneously the tenor is singing those pretty notes, and then goes above the alto. So at that point, it's simultaneous. At this single moment in time, the tenor is above the alto, right? So that's called voice crossing. Bach does it all the time, but Bach does it when he's writing pieces. If you're doing, a voice leading exercise, don't do it. That's the basic idea. It's just like with a crossword puzzle, you don't get to add boxes. Voice leading exercises are like crossword puzzles or games. Okay, so then you have voice overlap, and this is the more tricky one, but if the alto is on, let's say this is treble clef, so the alto is on F here, then on the next beat, the next time they're both singing, the tenor here goes above where the alto was. right? Stuff that often does not jump out, but it does jump out if, like, what's happening here is both voices are leaping up here. And the result is that basically you don't hear the orange going to the orange and the blue going to the blue. You hear the orange going to the blue, and then it sounds like there's an extra note there, and this guy just got left off. I mean, it's something like that. That's the reason for this. So if you were writing piano music, you could do this definitely because your hand can jump all over the keyboard. But if you are writing a voice leading exercise for voices, you do want to avoid these things and keep these things in mind. Okay, so voice crossing, simultaneous. Overlap is successive. Guideline number 4, I put this in gray because it's not super important, but avoid direct or hidden octaves and fifths between the outer voices unless it's a soprano moves by step. I know that's going to be strange. We'll probably go over it in another video. But what is direct motion? Direct and hidden mean the same thing. So hidden fifths, hidden octaves are the same as direct fifths and direct octaves. It means if you have two voices, let's say bass and soprano, and if they're both moving up from a sixth and they end up on a fifth, say, and if the soprano doesn't move by step, then it kind of sounds like you have parallel fifths going into that second one. I know that's not a very good explanation right now, so let's just leave this in gray for now, not worry about it too much. I think I'm going to have to go inside so I don't get rained on, but I'm going to give you a picture of the sky so you can see what's going on. Are you ready? Pretty cool. Maybe I should brave it. I should stay outside as long as I can without getting electrocuted. Okay, here we go. I'm staying outside. Construct your chords logically. It's easy, or at least that seems a reasonable thing to ask. Guideline number 5, just a guideline. Try to write complete chords. But if you're going to omit a note, you're actually totally allowed to, and you just shouldn't omit the root. Don't omit the third. If it's supposed to be a 7th chord, don't omit the 7th. So that just always leaves the 5th. You're allowed to omit the 5th whenever you want to. Guideline number 6. When you're thinking about doubling, if you have 4 voices and there's only 3 notes in the chord, typically you want to double the root. If you can't do that, if the voice leading works out better if you double the 5th, then double the 5th. Some people say don't double the 3rd, but you totally can double the 3rd, especially in a minor chord, definitely. Major chord, you can. The only time you don't want to double the 3rd is if it's a 5 chord, because the 3rd of the 5 chord is the leading tone, you don't want to double the leading tone. Okay, so for inversions of chords, you're usually going to double the bass. So if it's a 1/6 chord, you often want to double the bass, right, which is the 3rd of that chord. If we are in C major, a 1/6 is a C, E, G, but with E in the bass, and so you just double the E. That's often a good thing. And then I just made a little warning there that you obviously can't do that for 5/6 chords or 5/6/5 chords, right, because the bass is the 3rd of the 5 chord, and the 3rd of the 5 chord is the leading tone, right? Otherwise, that rule is pretty good. Also, for 6/4 chords, as you'll learn, you typically do want to double the bass note, which is going to be the 5th of the chord. Yeah, remember, no doubling of tendency tones. Okay, 4th big ol' category, tips for avoiding problems. Guideline 7, might want to start writing the outer voices first. So if you're doing a figured bass exercise, you're given the bass line and the figures. You got to figure out what the chords are, and then the first thing to do might be to pencil in a soprano melody. I often pencil in the notes above the bass line that are like the vocabulary that is in the chord, and then try to make a melody out of it. But one way or another, it's good to write the outer voices first and then fill in the inner voices, or at least that's a possible way to start working, which you can experiment with. Guideline number 8, move the outer voices in contrary motion as much as possible. So you got your bass line given. When you're writing a soprano line, you might want to just start with the idea of like, every time the bass goes down, I'll try to go up in the soprano. Every time the bass goes up, I'll try to go down. And then, you change as necessary to get a good melodic line in the soprano, but that's sort of a good starting principle. The very first chord that you set up, he suggests, why don't you start with the complete chord, right? Don't leave out the 5th, and do it in close position. So that means the bass can be, close position has different meanings, but in this case, the bass can be as far away as possible, but all 3 notes in the upper voices, the tenor, alto, and soprano, would be all within 1 octave of one another. So you could start with the upper voices in close position, and then you can move around to wider spacing as necessary, but you kind of try to keep close position. Let's keep that one in gray. It might work. Why don't you try it? Guideline number 10, avoid leaps in multiple voices simultaneously. So let's say your bass is moving up by step, then you could, if you wanted to, you could do a leap in the soprano. If your bass is leaping up, you really probably don't want to simultaneously leap in the soprano. If you have to leap in one of the inner voices, you're allowed to. But you kind of want like 60 to 70 to maybe even 80% stepwise motion in most lines. Yeah, let's not say 60. Let's say 70 to 80% stepwise motion. So leaping and skips are okay. Skips of like thirds, but leaping is pretty rare. So you probably don't want it to be happening in the outer voices simultaneously. Ooh, look, we've already got some things on the screen. Voice leading, 5 and 5/7. This is from chapter 6. Just a reminder, leading tone, it's going to go up. Scale degree 7. You can also think of this little caret thing as being an arrow pointing up. So scale degree 7 wants to go up. If it's in an inner voice, it doesn't have to, but if it's in the outer voice, it has to. So the term, I called the scale degree 7. I also call it the third of the chord, third of the 5 chord, or sometimes called the chordal third, but that means the same thing. Okay, then that's completely different from the chordal 7th. So remember 7th versus scale degree 7. 7th, every time you hear the TH, think going down. The 7th of the chord, or the chordal 7th, but it's scale degree 4. If it's a 5/7 chord, the 7th of the 5/7 chord is scale degree 4. If we were in major, then it's Fa, Do, Re, Mi, Fa. So a 5 chord would be Sol, Ti, Re, Fa. And then Fa wants to go down to Mi. And Ti, which is the leading tone, the third of the 5 chord, Ti wants to go up to Do. Fa, Mi, Ti, Do. Let's just do that in minor. In minor, the 7th of the 5 chord is Re, Do. And the scale degree 7, the leading tone of the 5 chord is Si. It wants to go up to La. Complete and incomplete chords. Perfectly okay to have a complete chord. Yes, obviously. But it's also perfectly okay to have an incomplete chord. If you follow all the voice leading rules and your leading tone, if you're always resolving it up, even if it's in an inner voice, then if you have a complete 5/7 chord, it's always going to resolve to an incomplete 1 chord. It's just this weird paradox. And vice versa, if you're like, no, I want to make sure I have a complete 1 chord, then you're going to have to make your 5/7 chord incomplete, unless you're going to break the leading tone rule that I said you can break when it's in an inner voice. So just get used to the fact that sometimes you have to do incomplete chords. It's perfectly okay. Some additional principles. Ranges. This is from Late's page 176. I got this picture from the internet. I think maybe the bass range is different from what Late's gives you, but all the other ranges are exactly the same. So soprano, definitely go down. So this is middle C, right? Sopranos, perfectly comfortable singing this range. You can, like this clef, you can think of this as soprano clef, and if you put this note as like D instead of C, it would be the note from below the treble clef to the note above the treble clef. So that clef represents the soprano's range. That clef does not represent the alto's range. If we did put an alto clef in here, her range would be like almost exactly the range of the alto clef. But you can just remember this as alto goes down a fourth below the middle C. This is also the lowest note of a violin, if that helps. The tenor, this C is the lowest note of a viola. And then up there, it's a G. That G, notice, is there on the treble clef. So there's obviously a lot of overlap there's a whole octave of overlap between alto and tenor, and only a fifth of overlap between soprano and tenor. Okay, and then the bass, this low E, if you went down to a low C, that would be the range of the cello. So you could think of this as cello, viola, violin, and then, I don't know, maybe soprano violin, something like that. Okay, so those are your ranges. Abbreviations. LL, leaping lizards. These are things I put on your homework. Leaping lizards mean you're leaping around too much and needlessly. DLT, it's like a BLT, but without the hold the lettuce, tomato, and mayonnaise, and instead you get a double leading tone. So remember, you're not supposed to double leading tone. 7th, if I draw a little arrow and a 7th it's because you didn't resolve the 7th of the chord down. If I have the 5 or the 8 in between those tilted lines, it means that you have parallel fifths or parallel octaves. VO, voice overlap, VC, voice crossing. You saw that in the previous screen. Q, sometimes if you get the quality of your Roman numeral wrong, like it's supposed to be a major one and you wrote lowercase 1, or vice versa, and I just write Q underneath it. And so just pay attention to, you got the quality of the chord wrong. Every once in a while, what I'm saying is more complex than that. Like, let's say, you guys don't have to do this till next year, but let's say you're in C major and there's a D major chord and you tell me it's just a 2, I will write Q below that, and you can't just write capital 2, you have to write 5 of 5. Anyway, it's probably not appropriate for your level just yet, so maybe don't worry about that. Q, wrong quality. And quality means major, minor, diminished, augmented, major, 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 minor, 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 diminished, minor, diminished, diminished. Okay, RN, Roman numerals. Pretty much on every homework, you're always putting in Roman numerals. So unless I specifically tell you to not put in Roman numerals, you should put in Roman numerals, even if late says don't use Roman numerals. Instructions for figured bass. I said this a couple screens ago, but you're always writing in 4 voices. If Lates gives you a bass line and it says figured bass, always write in 4 voices, even if he forgets to say, set this in 4 voices. Okay. And always include Roman numerals, even if he forgets to say, put in the Roman numerals. Right? It's like, once you're past a certain age, people don't have to tell you to put your shoes on before you go to work or go to school, right? I think that's basically the idea. He just forgets sometimes to say, okay, put your shoes on. Okay. Anyway, that's what figured bass means. 4 voices, including Roman numerals. Okay, cadence types. We mentioned these on in the previous screen, but I put them here for review. You guys haven't learned the predominant function yet, but this is going to be either a 2-chord or a 4-chord. So, and right now you could just ignore it. So here you have a phrase that has tonic for a while and then dominant and goes dominant tonic. So 5-1, that makes it authentic. And then if the soprano goes 2-1 or 7-1, and these chords are in root position, then it's perfect authentic. Imperfect authentic cadence would be a similar thing, except the soprano ends on scale degree 3 or scale degree 5. And I didn't mention that it could also be if these chords are in inversion. But this is the most common thing. It's just that the soprano is not resolved, but the harmonies are. Okay? Half cadence is you end on the 5 chord instead of ending 5-1. Phrygian half cadence, remember we already said, is just half cadence in minor, and the 4 chord that you're going to 4 to 5, and the 4 chord is in first inversion. So 4-6 going to 5. Remember, scale degree 6 going to scale degree 5 in the bass. Always in minor. So that would be Fa going to Mi in the bass. Okay, these things, we call them cadences sometimes, but that's just like, people on the street call them cadences. We in this class don't think of them as cadences. The plagal, so-called plagal cadence that goes 4 going to 1, you're allowed to say amen over a 4 chord and a 1 chord, but don't think that anyone's going to assume that that's a cadence. It usually comes after an actual cadence, so it's sort of tacked on at the end. Deceptive cadence, you go through the music and you may really feels like you're on the 5 chord and it feels like you're about to go to a 1 chord, and the melody often does resolve to scale degree 1, but you trick your audience by putting a 6 chord underneath that scale degree 1 in the melody, so it's deceptive, and then you're like, it wasn't a cadence. I was tricked. I was deceived. Okay, and then evaded cadence, you're on the 5 chord, it's about to go to 1, but that doesn't, you're on 5 and it goes to the 5-4-2, the 7th is in the bass of that chord, and you're like, whoa, what's happening? The ground is falling out from under us, and then a 5-4-2 always has to go to a 1-6, so you go back to a weak 1 and you have to cycle around and go back to the cadence again. So that's how you evade the cadence. You evade the cadence this way by going 5-4-2 to 1-6. You kind of evade the cadence in the deceptive case as going from 5 up to the 6 chord. In both cases, you have to cycle back around again and go to a real cadence to end the phrase. Okay, and this is the last screen of the presentation. I just wanted to put these terms in here, I think sometimes in some of the readings, maybe in musician, but maybe not. There's different terms for the types of cadences in Britain, and you'll at least read this in books every once in a while, even on like Wikipedia. So, and it definitely can become confusing because what we call a half cadence, right, something ending on 5, in British terminology, it's called an imperfect cadence. And our term imperfect means something completely different. Our imperfect thing is an authentic cadence that goes 5-1. So this one is very confusing. They're deceptive. Their term deceptive, that's fine. It's just, they call it interrupted. And we actually do use the term interrupted for something different that we'll get to at the end of the semester. Okay. And then last here, in terms of note durations, if you've taken music history courses, oh, it's really raining. You know some of these terms. Brev, semi-brev, minim, semi-minim. Crotchet is the British term for semi-minim. Meaning semi-minim is the older term. Crotchet is what they call it today. This is a quarter note. Quaver is an 8th note. Semi-quaver is a 16th note, I think. Anyway, minim is whole note for us. Well, no, minimum is half note. Semi-brev is whole note. Brev is double whole note. Okay, it's really raining. My presentation is done. Goodbye, everybody. I'll upload this, and you'll have another video coming tomorrow. Okay.